Eric Adler, and I'm a professor of classics and currently the chair of classics at the University of Maryland, where I teach mostly Latin and some Roman history and so forth.
Fascinating. So I know Coolidge was into the classics. He was very much a student of it. And a lot of his rhetoric seems to embody some of the antithesis styling of the classics. What do you think future policy directors and leaders can learn from, even apart from policy, but sort of the wisdom and how to convey through language important ideas and to sort of build trust, credibility, teamwork?
That's a great question. I think that the way you've characterized Coolidge's education is correct. He was a lifelong fan of the classics, even though he wasn't a classicist. So he studied a lot of classics in secondary school, and he studied some when he went to Amherst College as well. But he was not someone whose sort of primary focus was on the classics. And he also thought that he wasn't necessarily such a good student of Greek. He wishes he had been better. He was better at Latin, but he sort of didn't think he was so good at Greek. And yet, he took lifelong lessons from the classics, I think. And he also had a lifelong affection for Cicero as an author. Now, this makes a certain amount of sense for Coolidge himself because he was both a lawyer and also a statesman, and Cicero was a lawyer and a statesman. But I also think it had an effect on his writing, too, and that he was one of the last American presidents who wrote most of his own speeches. And I think he was able to do that in part because he had studied the classics. Not only because he had studied the classics, but partly because he had. I don't think in this day of age that necessarily statesmen of the future have to study only the classics in order to become literate people or people who are good writers. But I would suggest that studying, say, the prose of Plato, the master of Greek prose, or the prose of Cicero, the master of Latin prose, those are good places to start if you want to end up being a good writer. They worked for Calvin Coolidge, they can work for others as well.
So maybe to build on that, classics are not sufficient, but perhaps they're a necessary component of becoming a well-rounded citizen of a community.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. So, in earlier American higher education, the classics really dominated, such that when Harvard got started originally as New College in 1636, their original admissions examination required no other subjects than Latin and Greek. Those are the only subjects you needed to have in order to go to gain admission to Harvard College. That, I think, we look at that today and say, that's too narrow, that's not going to work. I think the problem has been that there has been a great diffusion that's gone along with the broadening. I'm in favor of broadening the curriculum in order to look not only at the so-called Western tradition, but to look at other traditions as well. But I worry a little bit that this ends up getting watered down by sort of putting everything in the curriculum. So mortuary studies and animal husbandry and so forth all have to compete with Plato and Aristotle and Confucius and so forth. So I do think that the classics are a part of being a well-educated person today, but I don't think we can any longer say that that's sort of the linchpin of being an educated person.
I see. You were just on a panel, and there were many students asking some, I thought, pretty thought-provoking questions. Yeah. And not all of the questions directed to you were exclusive to classics. Obviously, they had some sort of relationship to it. But it strikes me that a lot of their perspectives may be coming from something of a silo, and perhaps that's coming. Perhaps that becomes more the case as someone spends more and more time on one particular subject. You referenced broadening the scope within what we can study as classics. I'm wondering how should education balance instilling these time-tested, sort of to Burke's point, the time-tested values and principles that we sort of tease out of the wisdom of time with emerging technologies, and how do we balance exploratory nature of college with specialization, preparation?
Yeah, that's great. That is a great question. I do think that it's a difficult thing to do, but it's a sort of both and kind of a thing, as opposed to an either or. It seems to me that modern colleges oftentimes, not entirely, but oftentimes are either or sorts of institutions rather than both and. And what I mean by that is this. If you're going to be an engineering major at a lot of colleges, you're going to have to take so many engineering courses that you're going to have very little time for other subjects. And the engineering is oftentimes intense enough that students, when they find their general education classes, tend to pick and choose them on the basis of whatever's easiest, whatever doesn't meet on Friday, whatever isn't at 9 in the morning, and so forth. Right, the easy A, who's the easiest professor, and so forth. That's not a good way to be educated. And I think one of the reasons why there were so many questions from the students after the panel was that there is a hunger among a number of students for something more than that, something more than merely vocational training with a few sort of smattering of classes added onto that as well. That a college education not only can prepare you for a job, but also can prepare you to live a life as a serious adult. That's something Calvin Coolidge recognized, I think, instinctively from his own college education, and I think it's I wouldn't say it's necessarily a universal hunger among students, but I do think a lot of students today feel that as well.